this computer. So with that, Tim, floor is yours.
Great, great. Thank you, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here. I been looking forward to this, and I know this is topic has been on the minds of a lot of people, and I think we need to do our best to kind of to address some of these issues coming out of drought. And by the way, I mean I welcome questions and stick them in the chat. We'll address those as we get a chance later in the program. Don't plan to keep you all night tonight, but want to spend some adequate time, um, talking about our forage base. And I think that's such an important thing. If we're raising cattle of any or livestock of any form, forages are so important. And if we don't have a, a good, solid base of forages to work with, we're losing money. It's just that simple. Um, so I want to kind of address this following drought. Uh, we probably in Stone County had our worst drought. Well, the worst one was in 2012, but I would say last year was probably worse than what some of you may be dealing with up on the state line this year or in 2023. But 2022 was not easy either. And, we had several going back to 2018 and then, of course, 2012. It's starting to look like it's just a normal thing to have drought issues. And what's really challenging is the droughts that happen late in the fall when we're trying to make steps to fix our problems that we have. Getting new forages up in the fall is sometimes challenging. But we're going to talk about several options for getting to the fall, and also what are some of the long-term challenges and goals that we might have and try to work towards those goals. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with wet conditions because we still have a little bit of wet conditions here. I don't know about where you're at, but some of our pastures have been pugged and a lot of hoof traffic, especially in the sacrifice areas, especially where we've been feeding hay. So may not look drouthy out there, but in many cases, we've got some torn up pastures. And I just want to assure you that a lot of these, if the stand is there, if the fescue stand is there, a lot of these pastures will repair on their own. The crowns are still intact in many cases, and it's always amazing how they come back. Not that they won't have some issues, but I think many of these can come back if they came into it in decent shape. But if you've got feeding areas that need repair, I think right now, and I want to focus on February, late February, where we're at right now, this is a good time to try to repair some of those or maybe get some forage growing in those areas if we feel like they're not up to par. And so there's some forage options I want to throw out there. I'm going to mention annual ryegrass, but I will say, and I want to make this clear, if you're in a cropping area, I probably would not recommend annual ryegrass. It is a very invasive weed worldwide in row crops, especially in our wheat. And so if you're in that area, I probably would not use annual ryegrass, but there are areas such as down here in the Ozarks where we don't have as many row crops. We're getting along pretty well with annual ryegrass. But that is one cool season grass that I do think can be established here in late February, early March, and still get some good benefit going into the early summer. And then it'll eventually die and drop seed, and then it'll come back from seed in the fall. Another option might be something like turnips or radishes. You can put those in some of those areas and try to get some feed in that area for the spring. This might be a time to repair with clover in those areas, or even lespedeza for the summer, or even crabgrass. I think crabgrass is a good forage for summer grazing. And if we've got a, kind of a caked area that's got a pretty good mat on it. It may not hurt to actually do a little soil disturbance with something like a a pasture drag or something like that to kind of open the ground up and get it ready to receive some seed. So let's turn the corner now and talk a little bit about assessment of fescue pastures. This is obviously a pretty good looking pasture here. A lot of forage growth in there, and I hope that's what your pastures are looking like. But I've got a feeling here in February, I got a feeling they're not quite there yet. You've probably already grazed off your fall stockpile. Most people have, and honestly, the ideal time to do an assessment of a fescue pasture is, to me, is in August, because that's just ahead of the time when we normally want to start doing something about it if we have some problems with it. So, there's several things to look for when we're assessing pasture, but in many cases, this is where we're at. We've overgrazed our pasture. I actually took this photo somewhere in Southwest Missouri. We'll keep that location hidden, but I took that photo on July 21 in one of our drought years, and just overgrazed. The thistles were still out there. There's some, not a lot of forage to work with, and really, as we're going into the 2024 season, um, I think we're still dealing with some low subsoil moisture. I think that's been an ongoing issue for us. We can't seem to get caught up. I don't pay attention to the subsoil moisture reports starting January 1 on. I think you have to realize that subsoil loss started way back in the previous year. And so many times it may be a little deceiving just looking at the subsoil moisture reports starting January 1. I think we have some carryover stand damage. I think there's been some overgrazing. I think in some cases we have fertility issues that we need to address. And I think there's potential for some weed problems. I mean, this is another picture. Excuse me. This is another picture from the drought. And I mean, obviously, these pastures are in rough shape. I mean, they're many of them have not fared very well and are still, have a long way to go before they're back where they used to be. And you add several years of this is when we start having some real problems. So, is your tall fescue stand really fescue? I think that's something we've got to ask. If we're dealing with weeds that are perennial weeds such as these, I think we've got to maybe take a long, hard look at what we really have, and how are we going to get rid of these, or how are we going to fix this problem? Now, broom sedge is one that is a perennial that we sometimes deal with, and some of these are probably bigger issues in hay fields, but such as purple top. We've had several fields, more and more fields getting filled with nimblewill. And nimblewill is a perennial, kind of a false Bermuda. It looks like Bermuda, but a lot of people think it's Bermuda, but it doesn't really graze well at all. Cattle just don't seem to eat it. And same with panic grass. Lindheimer's panic grass is one that we've been seeing more and more of. And cattle just don't seem to touch it. The sedges are the same way. But, going back to the broom sedge, some people call it sage grass. This was a picture from November on a farm visit in Taney County, Missouri, where, the producer got this land back. It was family land, but it had come back into his possession where he could work it and farm it. And this is what he was dealing with. And, there may be some little blue stem in there too, but I think most of that was broom sedge, and there's some foxtail. And when he called me on the phone, I was thinking, this is going to be rough. I mean, it's been hayed to death. It hasn't been fertilized and who knows how long. And it's been just hayed, and he wants to run cattle on it again. But when I got out there, the good news is there was fescue under it. It was not thriving, but there was fescue under it. And we have had some research here in Missouri about 15 or so years ago at one of the research farms where you can see, just following soil test recommendations, getting not only the lime taken care of, which is what everybody seems to naturally go to for some reason. It's not just about pH, but in this case, it also needed an adjustment on phosphorus. And over time, in about 3 years of adding phosphorus, you can see the difference in the broom sedge. And the broom sedge started to go away. So in the Missouri study that Dr. Dale Blevins did, they found that addressing lime and phosphate fertilizer, according to soil test recommendations, really made a difference. And simply, it just caused the desirable species to come back and get thick again, and the undesirable went away. Now you can say, well, that's always the case, low phosphorus and low pH. But there was a study in Kentucky that I found done on 18, 19, and 20, and they actually found a site that was low in potassium. And so they applied several treatments, as you can see here. So these treatments were unfertilized control. There was a triple 19 application, 200 pounds. There was I don't know why they went quite so high in potassium, but upwards to 360 pounds of potash was applied. And here are the results that they found. And this was the effect of the, of the fertilizer application at the end of the study. And you can see where they applied no fertilizer, the broom sedge was still the dominant species there in the yellow bar, but the green bar was the cool season grass, and even a moderate amount of fertilizer started to make a difference. But really, when they started addressing the fertility need, that turned out to be mostly potassium, you can see it went away in a hurry. So, it's really, I think the bottom line here is, take a soil sample and see where you stand, and then really, follow that soil test recommendation as close as possible. All right. We also want to look at our pastures and realize, even some of the species that are pretty nutritious for beef cattle, sometimes they're a little heavy in some of the forages that we like to grow. White clover in particular can sometimes be a little heavy in some of our fields. I haven't seen that quite as much as we were seeing it, but it's still there in some fields. And sometimes it's the old white Dutch clover that is not very productive, and that's a challenging one. But I'd probably find more fields that are just full of Kentucky bluegrass, and I think Kentucky bluegrass is an outstanding forage, but it just doesn't hold up as far as producing tonnage throughout the season. So we've had several cases where, fields turned out to be mostly Kentucky bluegrass, and they weren't fescue as everybody thought it was. Sometimes that's what's causing us not to have the hay yields that we once had. So if you've got these, maybe it's time to do a complete renovation and come back. Now, these are species I think we can deal with. Crabgrass and foxtail. Crabgrass is not necessarily an undesirable species in my view. I think it's one of the more nutritious forages that we have. Foxtail, on the other hand, is probably one that, even though it has a very similar life cycle, these are both annuals. The annuals can be broken in their life cycle because of frost. But the foxtail is just one that we just don't get a lot of grazing out of. Cattle just do not seem to like it, and for good reason. And also, it's not desirable for horses as well. I also feel like, you know, in many cases, we've done this to ourselves. I think the drought has exacerbated the problem. But in our hay fields, I think in many cases, we end up cutting way too low. I really believe this. I think we have destroyed a lot of stands. We have some outstanding equipment available now to get the job done, get it done quick compared to what we used to use with sickle bars. But, you know, these disc mowers are great, but you know, the first inkling for us to, you know, when we get ones, we want to put it on the ground and get everything we can. And that's not always that good of a plan. It really isn't. And let me tell you why. Here is a study using orchard grass in Kentucky with Dr. Ray Smith. And they took a 4-year stand of benchmark plus orchard grass, and they cut it consistently at 3 different cutting heights: 1/2 inch, 2 inches, and 4 inches. And then they used 4 different treatments, including no fertilizer at all. And all this was a replicated trial. And here were some of the stand densities that they had after the 5th harvest. Now, this was after the 5th harvest. You can clearly see how cutting height was the dominant issue. It was not fertility. Fertility didn't really come into play so much as far as persistence of the stand. It was cutting height. And many times we're at 2 inches or less when we're harvesting hay. And when it comes to grasses, most grasses, some legumes, I think we need to be much higher than that. And preferably, I would say 4 inches is a good place to be. And you can see that it was 90% plus, some cases 100%. Still, the stand was there. And everybody complains about orchard grass not staying with us. Well, here, after 5 harvests, we still had almost a full stand at 4 inches. 1/2 inch cutting height, only 20% or less. And so tells a real story. And the picture here tells an even bigger story. And that is, these are pictures directly out of the plots themselves. And you can see that the 4-inch cutting height, even with no fertilizer, still had a pretty good stand at it. Whereas on the left side, 1/2 inch cutting height with the higher fertilizer application, stand was dying out. So tells the story. And there's just so many benefits to, you know, the higher cutting. I mean, your regrowth is going to happen faster. You're going to get greater second cutting yield if you can get an earlier start. But a good second cutting yield is going to be more potential. And really, from a drought perspective, the canopy that is provided by a higher cut is an insulation for heat, and it will retain the moisture. And so we also find that it has a deeper, stronger root system. We also will have greater weed competition, and we'll have greater persistence in the long run. These are the same things we've been talking about in Missouri grazing schools for years, as far as leaving some residual behind with grazing. The same thing applies with hay cutting. And so, and also another thing to consider here is the lowest cutting of hay, the lowest inch or two, is going to be the poor quality hay. And we're not really gaining that much. And I figured that up one time, and it really was a pretty negligible amount of gain in tonnage. And it's the lowest quality tonnage of the whole hay harvest. So, you know, I think it's something we need to consider. Now, the next question that comes up is, how do I cut that high? How can I cut that high? My equipment is not set up that way. And we all know that disc mowers cut better when they're down low. Now, it's important to understand that a disc mower was never intended to be a ground contact device, but it does, I will concede, it does cut better when it's lower than if we had it up high. But it's not necessarily about how good the field looks when we come out of the field either. It's what's left behind that we have to deal with. So, some of the alternatives may be, depending on the machine you're using, cylinder stops will help us. Sometimes we need to either buy or fabricate skid shoes. And I think this is a question we need to ask the dealers if we're buying particularly newer equipment. What can we do to get our hay cutting heights higher? And many of them have alternatives. I've talked to them. They have plans in place, but it's just a matter a lot of times we don't even ask for that. And we're not willing to spend a few more $100 possibly to get the equipment in shape for good hay cutting. So just wanted to touch base on that because I do think that's a significant issue in the hay when we're making hay. Now, I want to touch also on the impending weed problem of 2024, because I do believe, just like last year, we have potential for a lot of weed problems if we've got some thin, tall fescue stands, things that are already out there, such as thistles. And in the middle of the page, we are seeing a lot of poison hemlock, or some people call it carrot weed, but poison hemlock. In some of our hay fields, we've got, seems like every drought we get more and more buckhorn plantain on the right side of the page. And then as we get into summer, we're looking at more ragweeds. These are some things that we can deal with. We have the tools to deal with them. Obviously, it's the more healed in annuals or perennials that we have to worry about. This happens to be buttercup. But things, it's all about timing of when we apply a herbicide, if we need to do that. And sometimes we can deal with a lot of weeds, but yet it's just when they get out of hand, we have tools to rein some of these in. And I like to use this slide because, I get a lot of questions about buckhorn plantain. And this was a farm visit again in McDonald County, Missouri, where we had a gentleman who used to work for Extension, John Hobbs, had a hay field that we walked through the hay field, and you can't see it, but majority of the field was just full of buckhorn plantain. But we walked through this one area that had a strip that was pretty well free of plantain, and there was clearly a lot more grass, kind of hard to see in the picture, but I did the best I could to take a shot of it. And I asked John, I said, what happened here? And he said, well, I was spraying Duracor last March. This was in July when we were talking. And sure enough, Duracor cleaned out the buckhorn plantain, in not only in that field, but this just happened to be a field he was spraying out the last of the load on the way back to the barn. So really, I think it's all about timing. I get calls about buckhorn plantain in June and July about what to do with it. And you won't get control in June or July with anything. But timing is everything. And 2,4-D and Duracor and Grazon PD3, which is the new one, and then also Grazon Next, all I think will work on this if we will do it more in November or even December on mild days, or as early as early March, when these are young and tender and easier to kill. I'm not going to say you're going to get them all, but they're easier to kill. Another one we've dealt with a lot was foxtail last year. Seems like everybody, regardless of how you manage your operation, was dealing with excessive amount of foxtail, which unfortunately means that the seed is all in the ground and ready for and primed for this year. Now, I feel like the best thing we can do for foxtail is to thicken up our stands. I mean, if you can thicken up your stand as it's before it's germinating, and we're not overgrazing as we're in the springtime, it's germinating generally in May. That's the best thing we can do to crowd it out. We may need to be renovating, may need to be spraying in some cases, but there are some products on the market now. I haven't checked in Kansas, but I know in Missouri it is um, now labeled to use a product called Facedel, which is a post-emergence on tall fescue stands. This one is relatively new to tall fescue. Actually, it's an old rice herbicide, but it's been proven to work fairly well. It is fairly expensive, and so for that reason, I haven't found a lot of people that wanted to try it. Most people who are putting a herbicide on foxtail stands is using Prow H2O, and it's labeled as a pre-emerge, and so you really got to get on it early so that it's going to be effective. Now, your strategy, kind of turn the corner here. Your strategy for how you're going to approach this rebuilding is going to vary depending on what your goals are. Are they short? Are they long-term goals? I want to touch on those. Do you have a good fescue stand, or is it a poor fescue stand? Or are you wanting to go warm seasons? What kind of a grazing system do you have? Is it a management intensive grazing system where you've got 15 paddocks or more? Or are you working with two or three fields? That has a lot to do with it. And of course, the one that nobody can answer, and that is what weather pattern is ahead. But you don't gain anything unless you have faith and confidence that that it's worth taking a risk to get things rolling. So let's talk a little bit about forage renovation. Again, timing is so important, and then rainfall following is also essential. This was a field in Christian County, Missouri, where they were able to get a rented drill from a soil and water conservation district, and on September 19th, got it planted right on schedule, and was happy to get it done. But there were a lot of people rolling drills in September last year, but there were also a lot of people that called us in December saying, "What should I do about my stands?" And my first thought, I didn't always say it, but my first thought was, "Well, what were you doing in September?" That's where I think we need to evaluate, what our stands are like just prior to the ideal time to be planting them. Now, I realized there were parts up along the state line of Kansas and Missouri that were probably still pretty dry. And sometimes, when it's still dry and it's not showing any signs of changing, you may not want to put seed in the ground. I get it. But there are times where, we might want to just thicken up a stand, but there's also times where we may need to just start over and do a complete burn down. And I feel like a lot of livestock producers that I work with, they're not crop producers, they're not crop farmers, they don't want to think like a crop farmer, they don't have the equipment like one. They get a little nervous about doing a complete burn down, but I want to assure people that sometimes that's the best thing you can do is start over if the timing is right. Yes, there's risk, but what isn't risky in the farm and ranch business? If you're wanting to do a complete reset and you want to get a new solid stand of permanent forages such as tall fescue, orchard grass, a warm season grass stand, sometimes we need to do a complete burn down with glyphosate. September is generally the ideal month for planting cool season forages, whether it's legumes, cool season legumes, or if it's cool season grasses. What I find though, if you're not doing a complete burn down, is that sometimes we've got so much foxtail and crabgrass in early September that it's hard to want to put a seed in the ground on top of that, especially if that's going to be green and lush for another month or so. So in that case, it may pay to do some delayed fall drilling, maybe as late as early October. I used to be kind of nervous about that, but I've seen too many cases where an October planting still came out okay. So at that point, we let nature take its course, and the frost is on its way and cooler weather, and these start to kind of melt down on their own, and then they're ultimately killed, just like a glyphosate application by maybe mid October. But if you've got perennial weeds that we discussed earlier, a complete burn down is probably the better way to go. But if it's primarily these annuals, I'd probably delay planting and just drill in. Now, I want to kind of touch on some long-term goals here. Um, I we had a few workshops back in what was it? I think Patrick was involved with them. They were um, building resilience uh, for the future programs that we did, and I think in order for us to build resilience coming out of a drought, we have to look at it a little bit optimistically. We got to remember that maybe droughts are a reminder that maybe we need to have a different game plan. Maybe they can be the beginning of a better way to farm if we're willing to adjust and adjust with this climate that's changing on us, seems like, and maybe start doing things a little different. And maybe since we have a break in the um, in our forages and they're not quite up to par and it's time to do renovation, that's the time when you might consider doing something a little different. And I think novel endophyte tall fescue is a great way to, when we got to redo a field, maybe a novel stand is a good way to address the endophyte problem. I'm not saying do it on the whole farm, but I think in some of the worst cases where we have, stands that need to be fixed, we're just needing to maybe consider using novel fescues there. And this field on the lower left-hand corner is in Stone County. This producer, bought this farm, and I think in 2017, it was nothing but broom sedge, blackberries, so much so you couldn't even get through it, and cedar trees. And he cleared it. Actually sprayed the blackberries first, and then he cleared it. And within a few short years, with some intermediate crops, he ended up having a beautiful stand of Texoma novel endophyte fescue. And so, it's not cheap to get there, but the economists, Joe Horner with University of Missouri and Matt Poore out of North Carolina State, have done some extensive evaluation of this, and they'll say, depending on the situation, it's somewhere between 2 to 5 years payback using novel endophyte fescue. And there will be a Alliance fescue program in March in Batesville, Arkansas this year. That'll be our closest one. And if you've never been to one, I highly recommend them. But there are several brands that are on the market that have been evaluated and have shown that they've worked out very well. And so these are just some of them. Now, here it is again. We're in February. A lot of times people are wanting to go ahead and start planting tall fescue, orchard grass, brome in the spring. But I'm just going to tell you, I don't think the spring is a desirable time. I think number one, it's 5 to 6 months behind the fall seedlings. Those seedlings may not look like they were doing much if they were planted last fall, but they've got a root system that's been working all winter long. Maybe not, in a huge way, but they've got more tillers. They are ready to jump in the spring. Those seedlings in the fall were a cool season seedlings that were planted in going into a cool season. In the spring, we're planting cool season grasses going into a warm season. And that's not always good because we've got a dry season ahead, potentially. It's going to be a drier climate than what cool seasons desire. And I think the weed competition can be greater. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that because I know there's been successes with it, but I do think that your odds of success are much lower for a spring seeding. If you're going to do it though, I think right now as soon as we can get seed in the ground through early March, would be the time to get it done. There is one exception, and that would be that annual ryegrass again. Annual ryegrass, we've seen it work in the spring, although I think you'll get more forage in the fall. It is an annual, so it will, drop seed and come back. And we've seen actually a good interplay between crabgrass and annual ryegrass. They're both annuals and they both have different seeding or different time of seeding, and they seem to work pretty well in some stands. Again, don't use these around row crops. They're not going to be good for being around row crops. So if you're down in the Ozarks, that's one thing, but maybe not around the row crops. Another option that we have is maybe a brassica, such as turnips or radishes. These really should not have a lot of competition. Usually we're a little disappointed if we're broadcasting these or drilling them where there's a good stand of grass. So, I mean, ideally, I see these working best behind corn or sorghum sudan or millet stubble. But if you're going to sow them, you can sow them in the fall as long as you get started early, and that's usually in August. But early September potentially. But you get much later than that, they just don't always do as well. If you're going to do them in the spring, they need to be done early too. And I would say, about now through early March, you can start putting these into the ground. I might wait just a little bit longer and get into March, but it's time to start considering this if you want to fill in some gaps, and particularly where you've got some thin areas and even some bare soil. This might be a good thing to throw in there for short-term grazing. You can also put some ryegrass in with these. Grasses work well with brassicas as far as the nutritional value of them. It's getting late, but we can still do some frost seeding of clover and lespedeza. Highly recommend this. I don't think we're using enough clover these days. Seems like we're getting away from it, but I truly believe that we can save on nitrogen and add to the nutritional value of our pastures and our hay crops when we use clover. And I don't have it up here, but there's some outstanding data from Wayne Flannery in Northwest Missouri that shows that tonnage is there when you're using legumes such as clover without nitrogen. And it can take the place of nitrogen. And that's something that can really, it's a lot cheaper to put clover out than it is to buy nitrogen. I think we could use a lot more red clover than we do in our fescue hay fields. I really believe that, especially if we no-till them in the fall, I think red clover in some of these fields really can give us a better quality hay cutting without the use of nitrogen. Now, one touch on some small grains. I'm a big believer in trying to have as much of a perennial system as possible so we're not having to plant all the time. But sometimes we do need to use some small grains or some annual forages in order to get us through. And I've had a lot of questions this winter about planting oats, mostly for hay, but sometimes for grazing. Here's a crop of oats from a local producer in Lawrence County, Missouri, the Mount Vernon area. And I believe that, spring oats, the quality is unsurpassed. And we've had really excellent quality oats in this area, early planted in the fall as well. Quality is outstanding. It's got to be wet wrapped, but usually pretty good. We'll say that feed oats is kind of a risky operation. I think it can be done, but you just don't always know what you're getting. So realize the risk when you buy feed oats. A certified oat variety is a much better way and safer way to go. I also know, at least in this area, that no-till oats that are planted early, such as now, is challenging. Now, that really depends on how much cover is on the ground. If you don't have a lot of cover and the sun can, or the soil can be seen by the sun, I would say there is some risk, some chance that you can come out okay. But we've had a lot of failures with no-till oats, and I hate to say that because I really believe in no-till drilling. But uh, it's often we try to plant these, go ahead and get started in February and early March. But we also have some producers in Stone County here that have often, in Berry County, that have planted and no-tilled oats following a wet baled rye crop. This is one gentleman in Stone County that has done this several times successfully, where they planted rye in the fall and they would take the baleage off. It's sometime early to mid April, which is early for a lot of people. But if you've got the ability to get it done with baleage equipment, many times there's often a window to get it done, and then immediately turn around. In this case, in 2020, he planted oats on April the 10th. The ground was warmer. There wasn't a lot of cover on that soil, and he's able to get it up. And then he harvested on June 18. And he conceded in these pictures that it was too late, it was too mature, but just the weather wasn't allowing him to get it done earlier. So altogether, between the rye and the oats, he got 10 bales per acre on 11 acres. So 110 bales of forage, wet wrapped, off of 11 acres is not a bad yield. So just thought I'd share that because that's something that seems to be working for them. Of course, they'll plant sorghum sudan grass following this. So really, that's 3 crops. Not always ideal when you're wanting to you've got an investment there, but to get the tonnage out of it, sometimes that's what it takes. I've got to touch on this. There is a spring barley. There's a spring triticale. We don't recommend that you plant cereal rye or a fall triticale or even wheat planted in the spring. If these are, winter wheats, forage, fall planted stuff, we just really don't want to plant those in the spring. We don't get the tonnage, but there is a spring barley. There's a spring triticale in Kansas State has had some data on some of these more on the western side of the state. But the reason we don't plant small grains in the spring is winter small grains is because we miss out on vernalization. And I've seen this firsthand. Usually vernalization is a seedling exposure to cool temps 5 to 43 days somewhere during the winter months that triggers reproductive development. And you say, well, we don't want reproductive development. We're looking for forage. But you've got to have the plant incentive to grow to produce a seed head in order to get reproductive or vegetative growth. And so, that's something that a lot of people don't realize, and they plant it and they get a stand, but they don't really get much tonnage in the spring. So there are some options. I mean, this is data from West Central Kansas, from Kansas State. You can see at Brownell and Garden City, there were some trials, and you can see that the oats, yielded as much as a little over a ton on the left side. Triticale and the oat triticale combination kind of beat everything out. But these are spring planted, spring forages that are used. So I just wanted to let you know that may not be seeing this sold everywhere, but it is an option for you. And you can mix and match. I mean, there are things like oats and ryegrass and turnips that sometimes are used. I see sometimes oats and peas can be planted. So there's several options out there. Now, moving on. is that we can kind of plan for summer grazing as well. And I think these are some options to look forward to. You know, going with a forage quality, a forage, improved forage crabgrass, or even in some cases in the southern ends of our states, Bermuda grass can be used if we want to go that route. But you can frost seed these things. These can be frost seeded now, let the cows tromp them in, let the winter kind of continue to frost seed them for us. And then when they're ready to germinate, they're going to germinate. So these are things that a lot of times we don't think about frost seeding, but I believe they can be used. And then the other option is to go with sorghum sudan grass or millet planted generally in May. Usually the time of seeding is when we hit about 65-degree soil temperatures. And in this part of our state, probably mid-May is the ideal time to do that. Now, lastly, I want to also touch on another direction that a lot of people have interest in. More and more interest with warm season forages, simply because we're dealing with warm, drouthy seasons and fescue's just not cutting it. Our stands have gotten thin. Our forage options are limited in drought. And if we have a native species that has proven itself in the past to survive hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, you know, on some of these prairies and even the hilltops, I think and the valleys, I think they can be grown again. These were here before tall fescue, but droughts can be the beginning of a better way to the farm. And if you're taking advantage of some of these opportunities there's some government programs out there that are pretty sweet deals in some cases. I can't speak on the Kansas side, but there's really something that's worth looking into to see what options you have. I think it's a worthy goal to, focus on grazing our tall fescue, getting the benefit in the fall and the spring. But honestly, we put way too much emphasis. I'm just going to say it. We grow way too much tall fescue for our hay, and it's not a good fit. We can never get it done right, and the weather's not right when it's ready, and then it's all too rank and mature when we finally get it harvested. And I think it's a better goal to start transforming some of our hay fields into warm season forages for summer haying and grazing. And if we have the opportunity to cut hay with tall fescue, let's do it. But most of the time we can't get it all done. And so I think this is a worthy goal for most producers. I think I would call the introductory warm season grass would be the crabgrass. We can also throw some annual Lespedeza in there with it. I think that there's lots of these that have proven themselves. They're not that expensive. They're not terribly hard to plant, although flowing in a box is sometimes a little bit of a challenge, particularly with Red River. But I do think that this is a good way to go. They're not as productive as the native grasses, but I think if you have the opportunity to put in native grasses and you're willing to be down a year, which is that's a hard sell, and I get that. But if you're willing to be down a year to let them establish in some of these fields, and then you can deal with the high price seed, it may be worth it. This is a gentleman from Purdy, Missouri that planted 10 acres his first year, and I highly recommend lower acreages on the outset so you can get your feet wet and then see how they go. These are some of the species that can be planted, at least in this part of the world. Big blue stem and Indian grass probably at the top of my list because of the weed control options that we have with imazapic, plateau herbicide, but we don't have that with eastern gamma grass or switchgrass. You can also throw in some smaller species like little blue and Cytos grama, but we've had some outstanding stands of big blue stem. This is a picture from Ozark County. I've been in this field. It's quite amazing. Uh, it's a solid big blue stem stand that used to be a Bermuda field, and it's continuing to grow out fine as well. Notice he's not scalping the ground, by the way, and that's really essential. So this was the second year of growth after the first year of planting and not doing anything with it. This is probably considered ideal first year growth. This is a picture I got from Pat Kaiser at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. We don't always get this, but sometimes we do. But this was planted on April the 20th in Knoxville, and this picture was taken September the 28th, several years ago. We had several demonstrations recently in the last few years, and this was one at Cassville, Missouri in Berry County. Again, April 29th was the planting date. I find that's a good time to be planting. Picture taken September the 4th. Worked out really well, and he's grazing cattle on it today. So many benefits. I mean, we've got folks in the stocker business over in Christian County, upper picture there, who, even though we're already in a drought, had lots of grass for stocker cattle to graze. We've had people who have decided that it's a better hay source than anything else they can grow. There's just so many benefits. I don't have time to get into these because I'm wrapping it up here, but it's just so many benefits, and yet there are many challenges as well. But taking it slow and getting, being willing to sit on it a little bit and invest a little cash on the front end, I think it can be a very rewarding venture. Timing is really important. We can do dormant seeding. Generally, that's done December through February, or we can do what we call preseason establishment. I like to see it done not so much on June the 1st, but more in late April, 1st of May, before everything else gets busy, get it in the ground. But I think more and more the dormant seeding is taking place, and we can either broadcast into a dead residual or a burned out area, or we can no-till it in, and the drills are out there in many cases. But you do need to have a drill that's capable of handling that light, fluffy seed. So, Patrick, Hunter, this is pretty much everything I'd prepared to talk about today. I'm wondering if there are some things in the chat that we need to discuss.
Yeah, Tim, there was a couple of questions. Well, one was more of a comment kind of question about frost seeding when as warm as it is right now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it is warm, and I think we are towards the end of our frost seeding opportunity, but I would still probably go for it. There was some Missouri research that says they got only 50% of the stand by waiting until April, for example, compared to doing it in February. If we can get down into the 20s, which we will be doing here probably tomorrow night, there's still some frost seeding left to be done. Who knows? We may have a foot of snow before it's all said and done. You know how March can be.
yeah,
So I feel like it's worth trying. And but our window is closing fast.
so to kind of add on to that question a little bit, like where we're at right now would, because the typical frost seeding is kind of a broadcast and working it in hoof action, those kind of things, working it in with the freezing and thawing of the soil and that kind of stuff. Since our temperatures are kind of high, would you switch to just a no-till, a drill type of seeding, or to increase ground contact, or would you still continue with kind of a broadcast seeding, kind of the frost seeding method,
Patrick,
or
I do think that particularly when we're on the edge here, a drill may be the safer route to take. Anytime you can get better seed to soil contact, you're going to be ahead. as long as you don't plant too deep.
Yeah.
And so, no, I'd say a drill could be used now. I like frost seeding because it's the cheapest way to go about it, and there's not much to it. Sometimes, though, you could put it in with your fertilizer. And I do think that many times we need to get our P and K on earlier than we do. Um, but maybe just a tad early sometimes for nitrogen. But I still think even nitrogen we can get along getting established, getting out earlier than we normally do, especially in hay fields.
Yeah. One question, is there a spring wheat variety?
Um, there are spring wheats out there. I have no experience with them. Maybe somebody on the Kansas side might have a little more experience with them. I could not find data on it, so I really didn't mention it. But spring wheats are an option, I'm sure. I just don't know where to get the seed.
Would coastal Bermuda be a thought in the future in our area?
I get questions about coastal Bermuda, and honestly, I really don't believe they are well suited for for us. Probably not much suited uh, in higher latitudes than northern Texas or southern Arkansas. Um, as far as getting through our winters, when we get below zero for a week or so, sometimes we may actually lose it. So it's not
Hmm.
something that we would recommend, but there are winter hardy Bermuda varieties out there on the market, whether they're seeded or in some cases sprigged. We have options here, and they're good options.
Um, can any warm season grass be broadcasted post wet weather close to May? And I know you touched on that a little bit after this question came into the chat, but you might elaborate or any more on that um, as far as seeding of warm seasons and broadcast seeding
Yeah,
and that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
and yeah, Sue, she's from my county here, and yes, I know that the crabgrass and the Bermudas are the ones that I'm most comfortable with doing that. However, I would not do that for the summer annuals such as uh, uh, sorghum Sudan grass or millet, because the potential for seed decay or early germination too early, and then we get a cold snap and we lose it. So these others are naturally reseeded, um, and so they can handle it. They can be sitting there all winter long, ready to be germinated at the right time. But sorghum Sudan, millet, sun hemp, things like that, I would not do that. Good
And
question.
then this is the last question that I've got here in the chat. And if anybody else has any other questions, they can sure send them in the chat. Interseeding warm season annuals into cool season pastures. I know I talk about this some, and I know
Mhm.
there's so what about doing that? Is that a good thing, bad thing? Is there certain times when that makes some sense
Well, it
or
depends on the warm season annual we're talking about. But I, in the past, I'll just be honest, have been a little bit cautious of planting uh, summer annuals like sorghum Sudan grass and millet into a good stand of tall fescue. But join us tomorrow night with Jamie Lynn Farney. She has some very interesting research, um, who's addressing this head on, and I've heard her speak on this topic before, and if you haven't heard this, you need to hear it. It's quite interesting what she's finding out 3 out of the 4 years that she has data right now. So uh, that's a good segue to tomorrow night's discussion. But I will also say, though, when it comes to crabgrass, I personally like to see management of forages stay within cool and warm season as best as possible and not mix the two, particularly with native grasses and also with Bermuda myself. but we have seen where crabgrass in the thin stands of fescue has worked really well. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. That's one exception. I've known of frost seeding crabgrass into summer or winter small grain crops successfully, where it came on after the small grain was taken out, whether it was grain or baleage. So that's an option as well.
Um, I think I'm going to throw a question here, and if anybody else has got one, but I know you touched a little, you didn't touch a lot on the seeding practices, or you touched some on the seeding practices in native warm seasons, but one of the things we talk about some is dormant seeding versus seeding more in the spring, early summer months, and I guess I would I would throw the question out there and kind of touch on those two practices and which one you kind of lend more towards, or the benefits or the problems with either one of those practices, and kind of what works better in our part of the country.
I think I think in firsthand experience, I would say that late April seeding has worked out really well. You know, that's putting it on almost pre-season in a way. It's not going to just jump out of the ground after that, but as we get into warmer soil temperatures in mid-May, I think by then it's starting to germinate, maybe even earlier than that. But that has worked real well, and a lot of people have have had that goal, and then the next thing they know, it got real busy or real wet in May, and then they can't get in the field, or they get busy with hay and other things, and they are planting crops, and they just can't get it done. And then the next thing they know, it's June, and we've had some terrible failures planting in mid-June. So I guess the answer, Patrick, to that question is be early and get it done before you have an opportunity for um, things to kind of go south on you. And I think the dormant seeding does have a lot of merit. We're talking, December on. We're not doing as much in December and on the farm outside of feeding cattle. But if you happen to have a dry spell and the condition is right, and you're not necessarily raising, got a summer annual or a winter annual in there, you could go ahead and plant it, drill it in, and then you'll just need to be really careful to come in and do a burn down early spring before it even germinates, and you can get some plateau on or a mazopic of some sort for good weed control in the spring.
So, Micah, you got your hand raised.
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
I can.
You said something about you can plant crabgrass in February, March, and then it'll come up.
Yes.
And then of course that's it'll go into the summer, and then so when you hit fall, could you potentially say you didn't have really anything on the field, or it was a former crop and your former crop field and you were having trouble establishing something? Could you plant crabgrass, and then whenever the crabgrass finishes, could you put on like a novel fescue? Would you have to kill that crabgrass, or would it be
Yes.
better to do it different,
Yeah, I
or
think
terminate it before it produces
if you
seed?
want, if you're wanting to go to a novel fescue stand, you probably ought to terminate that. And if you get it terminated early enough, and you're not planting into green grass, and it's dried out, we can drill through that. I mean, the ideal way and the most common way is to use sorghum Sudan grass,
Sorghum Sudan and then novel fescue,
and then terminate it because it's easier to plant in, or a German foxtail millet or something like that.
okay, but you can't plant
But
those till May, right? Or when can
yeah,
you
those are
plant
going to be
them?
May.
May, when you put the millets in, or the sorghum Sudan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, is there any more questions or anything?
Hey Tim, this is Hunter. I do have a quick question for you.
Yes, sir, Hunter.
Talking about maybe converting some acres into warm season grass. What's your thoughts? Maybe you mentioned this already, but looking at like your fertility needs on warm season versus cool season like a fescue. Um, there seems to be some benefits there.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me go back to that one slide. Um, you know, that is a huge benefit. The field I was showing you from Ozark County, Missouri, that gentleman had used Bermuda grass for years as his hay source. But he said, hands down, I was making more tonnage with a native, in this case, big blue stem, than Bermuda, and I was using just a fraction of the fertility. I mean, our standard nitrogen recommendation is 60 units. You might go up to 80 of nitrogen per acre on natives, whereas it may be 180 units on Bermuda grass to get a lot of tonnage. I mean, I know one guy that has made 8 tons of forage with Bermuda grass, but he spoon fed it all summer and he spent a ton of money. And usually you got to put as much pounds of potash on, if not more, than the nitrogen to get all that tonnage. But really, the native grasses, there's a limit to them. Of course, I can show you data. Don't have it in this presentation, but this, they can make more tonnage than fescue, and on a lot less money when it comes to fertility needs. They're just much more beneficial in utilizing the fertility that's already in the soil, I think, because of its extensive root system.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, not seeing anything else in the chat and everything. I want to thank Tim tonight for his presentation, and want to thank all those asked questions and everything. And again, as we said earlier, this presentation, I've recorded this presentation, so I will get that sent out to you hopefully tomorrow. We will, if you don't get it or whatever, for some reason you can't read the format I send it in or something like that, let me know and we'll try to fix that problem. But do want to thank you all, and again, we'll be on here again tomorrow night. Jamie Lynn Farney is going to talk about incorporating. Well, Tim kind of talked a little bit about it, some of her annual work and kind of using kind of annuals in your forage system, and kind of rebuilding some of that and utilizing annuals in that system. And so again, thanks. And you guys have got my email. Here's Tim's contact information, so you have that. If you have any questions or anything related to this presentation, you can always contact him and he'd be more than happy to answer those. But with that, thank you all, and we'll see you again tomorrow night, hopefully.